Afternoon, everyone. I'm Colonel Lincoln Farish. Let's talk urban guerrilla operations. Urban guerrilla operations. Now, this is as envisioned by Carlos Magrella. We'll get to who he is in a minute and why that matters to civil affairs. And as always, this is not endorsed by DoD, the U.S. Army, USCAPOC, SWIC, or any other government entity. All right, some definitions. Guerrilla warfare was first coined by the Spanish when Napoleon invaded Spain and set his brother up as king. Guerrilla warfare is a type of asymmetrical, irregular warfare in which small groups of combatants avoid large, set-piece, force-on-force battle to attrit a larger, more conventional force. Terrorism is the use of intentional violence and fear to achieve political or ideological aims, usually by targeting the civilian populace. These are both methods of achieving political goals. Insurgency is the movement to overthrow the existing government by one of the above methods or some other method. Now, there's a lot of overlap with these terms for obvious reasons, and it should also be noticed that all the above are considered criminal activities and subject to criminal prosecution by civilian authorities. A belligerent is a lawful combatant recognized by the established government, and the clash is a civil war. So if the Farish irregulars expropriate, that is rob, a bank to fund the revolution, that is a criminal act and everyone is subject to prosecution by civilian authorities. If Iraq invades Kuwait and expropriates Kuwait's gold reserves, Iraq may be forced to return the gold, but no one is going to jail for that incident because everyone is a lawful combatant and the clash is between two belligerents. Partisan is the term used in the Geneva Convention. Now, this term became guerrilla by the 60s and are now insurgents in modern parlance. All of them are civilians. They're not lawful combatants, do not get prisoner of war status if captured, and are subject to criminal prosecution. All right, when it comes to guerrilla operations and insurgency, there are 5 things you need to have a chance of success. A leader and a vision. Now, when it comes to the leader, who you start with and who ends up in charge are often not the same person. And the vision the insurgency offers at the beginning often changes once the insurgency becomes entrenched or in charge. Cadre. Now, this is a team or several to teach new recruits TTPs. Often these were state-sponsored, historically Soviet, now Iran, that would bring expertise in how-to and share amongst the various groups. And these observers from sovereign countries may augment instruction conducted by local forces. A safe zone. You need the creation of a no-go zone. Whether across a border or an area lacking governance, it's necessary for rest and refit. Funding, often state-sponsored, possible to be enacted on a budget like Cuba. Support, active, passive, or tacit. You have to have one of those 3 because support from the populace is key. So long as they're not actively working against you, you'll be able to continue your guerrilla operations. Also, you need international, again, active, passive, or tacit support to prevent international retaliation or support of the government that you're trying to overthrow. So Carlos Magrella was the real deal. He was a Brazilian communist and guerrilla. He was an advocate for the Stalin style of communism. One-party totalitarian police state, rapid industrialization, collectivization of agriculture, a cult of personality. He was a member of the Brazilian Communist Party, Partido Comunista Brasileiro, PCB, and visited China in 1953 to 54, studying the Chinese Communist Revolution under Mao. Now, under Mao, it was even more brutal than Stalin, but Mao had a focus on the rural peasantry as opposed to the working class that Marx and Stalin used. In 1967, he participated at the first conference of Latin American Solidarity in Havana and wrote some questions about the guerrillas in Brazil dedicated to the memory of Che Guevara, which got him expelled from the PCB. All right, far from being deterred after being tossed out by the PCB, Magrella went his own way and founded Ação Liberté Nacional in 1968. Once ALN was up and running, they engaged in a series of robberies, kidnappings, and assassinations. They kidnapped the U.S. ambassador to Brazil and assassinated U.S. Army Captain Charles Chandler, who was in the country to study Portuguese. They left a nice note behind. Create 1, 2, 3 Vietnams. These are the words ordered by the commander Che Guevara, who was cruelly assassinated in Bolivia by imperialist agents such as this Chandler, notorious criminal in the war in Vietnam, today punished and executed by the revolutionary justice. Carlos's reign did not last long. He was ambushed and killed by police on 4 November 1969 in Sao Paulo. We're still begging the question, though, why Carlos Magrela? He wasn't a good guy, and he wasn't big and well known like Abu Nidal or Ilyich Ramirez Sanchez. However, he did give the world one thing which has lived on: the mini manual of the Urban Guerilla, published, written just before his death, and Berkeley, as part of its purported free speech movement, translated into English and published it worldwide. The book became a critical training guide, read, used, and features are implemented by the Weathermen, Irish Republican Army, Greek N-17, Basque ETA Separatists, Red Army Faction, Red Brigades, and Direct Action Fronts. Any insurgent group that was in existence in the 70s and 80s had this manual and utilized it. All right, from here on, we're going to be quoting directly from the mini manual, because how Carlos set this up is quite interesting. You get an idea of the mentality of people who believe that revolution is the only way. So the Urban Guerilla is a revolutionary and ardent patriot, a fighter for his country's liberation, a friend of the people, and of freedom. The second one's really important here. The Urban Guerilla differs radically from the criminal. The criminal benefits personally. The Urban Guerilla follows a political goal. Remember that when we get to expropriation. The Urban Guerilla is an implacable enemy of the regime, inflicts damage on the authorities, people who dominate the country, and exercise power. The Urban Guerilla attacks and destroys the wealth and property of foreign managers and the Brazilian upper class. This next quote might as well be straight from Karl Marx and provides a nice justification for guerrillas to engage in the kind of destruction that they are known for. The Urban Guerilla is not afraid to dismantle and destroy the economic, political, and social system. His goal is to help in the creation of a new and revolutionary social and political structure with the armed population in power. Therefore, it's okay to burn it all down, because somehow, when we rebuild, it will be better and freer, and everyone will be more prosperous, and best of all, the population will be able to resist tyranny rearing its head. Of course, like a lot of things, what you're promised and what you get, just a bit different. The mini manual spends a lot of words on justifying the brutality that one would engage in if they went down the road of insurgent. And it's also honest in a way where it doesn't shrink by using a lot of flowery words and just comes out and says, you're going to kill people. The Urban Guerilla's reason for existence, the basic condition in which he acts and survives, is to shoot. Not something you often see in a training manual. No one can become an Urban Guerilla without paying special attention to technical preparation. The Urban Guerilla can have a strong physical constitution only if he trains systematically. Got to do your PT. The highest level of preparation for the Urban Guerilla is the training camp for technical training. Again, pointing out why you need cadre. Your average person coming off the street is not going to be an effective guerrilla. You're going to need training. They're going to need training, and they're going to need technical training. Now, when it comes to a safe zone, Carlos Magrela basically says there aren't any, but if you do have one, that's where you want to put your technical training camps. Otherwise, no fixed bases except in a rudimentary sense of a weapons factory in a house. Because again, remember, he's focused on the urban, not hiding out in a mountain. The Urban Guerilla needs to move about constantly, needs to maintain an information service and early warning, needs to execute spies and informers. Again, while a brutal reality, not something you often see in a manual, the Urban Guerilla's greatest weapon lies in hiding and attacking by surprise. Funding. So the mini manual is actually kind of honest. Until you have a revolution up and going, it's going to be very difficult to get state actors to help fund and bankroll you. So how do you get going? Well, money, weapons, ammunition, and explosives must be expropriated. They must be stolen. The manual spends a lot of time justifying actions that are criminal, but okay because it's done by revolutionaries for the revolution. Expropriation is the first step in organizing our logistics. The expropriation, funding via the expropriation of government resources and the wealth belonging to rich businessmen, the large landowners, and the imperialists. Small expropriations used for sustenance for the individual guerrilla. So you remember where Carlos said that guerrillas weren't criminals because they didn't rob to fund themselves? Well, again, maybe this is an exception. Funding via bank robberies. The tremendous cost of the revolution must fall on big businesses, imperialists, large landowners, and the government. I guess Carlos forgot, where does the government get its money? The menu manual goes into support, how to get it, how to maintain it. So first off, you start with the idea the government is unjust, incapable of solving problems like stopping people from robbing banks and shaking down store owners, and resorts to the liquidation of its opponents. The government is so bad and so evil, we are compelled to rise up and take the money from this bank to fund our revolution against the bad, evil government. As soon as a reasonable portion of the population begins to take seriously the actions of the urban guerrilla, his success is guaranteed. Carlos has a point here. Once you have the support of the populace, some level of support, you become an entrenched insurgency and it becomes very difficult to root out. The guerrilla enforces tacit support. Let he who does not wish to do anything for the guerrillas do nothing against them. Or in modern parlance, snitches get stitches. Although with Carlos, you probably get a bullet in the back of your head. Propaganda during a bank robbery, which Carlos shifts slightly to call a bank assault. He, the urban guerrilla, must use the assault for propaganda purposes at the moment it is taking place. Distribute material explaining the objectives of the urban guerrilla as expropriator of the government and ruling elite. So again, in Carlos's world, only the wealthy have a bank account. All right, so the mini manual goes on with lots of different concepts that are well defined so that even a dilettante could start to use this manual to set up things like security, a cell structure, how to engage in propaganda, when you're supposed to execute various people, kidnappings, raids and penetrations, logistics, and lots of justification. Why it's okay for the guerrilla to steal and kidnap and kill and destroy and lie, because the government is so bad. The guerrilla is compelled to do these terrible things, but only for the duration of the emergency, which of course everyone realizes emergencies always seem to go on and on and on. When you're talking about the urban guerrilla, you also have to define what is urban, what makes it a city. Now, cities are usually defined by size. It's not the only way they're defined, but it's the easiest way. So you have a megalopolis, which is 10 million people or more, or a large city, which is 300,000 to a million people, or a village, which might have a couple hundred to a couple thousand people. We find ourselves asking, why do we care urban versus rural? And it's important because in 75, just 3 of the world's urban cities were megalopolises: Tokyo, New York, and Mexico City. Only 3 had 10 million or more residents. They're now 31. It's projected to grow to 41 by 2030, by the end of the decade. There are about 55 cities that are over 5 million residents. As of 2009, for the first time in history, there are more people living in an urban area than a rural area. So where are the gaps in governance? Where are the places where people are upset with what's going on? Where can insurgents and criminals recruit more members? It's not going to be in the rural areas anymore. So the importance of this is realizing that if you have 14 million people in a very small concentrated area, trying to provide stability because of a flood or famine or insurgency is much more difficult than trying to do the same thing when people are spread out. To add more fun and excitement to our life, we have refugee camps. Remember, a refugee is someone who crosses an international border, and UNRWA recognizes 59 refugee camps at the moment, some of which are almost the size of large cities. When the UN sets up a refugee camp, they try to organize it with 16 families making a community, 16 communities making up a block, 4 blocks making a sector, 4 sectors called a settlement. You can find it all in the UN Sphere manual which I recommend you have for reference. What's the difference between a refugee camp and a large town? Because half of refugees are in protracted refugee situations, which is defined as 25,000 people from one country living in another country for 5 or more years. But the thing is, a town has a bunch of different services within it that are integral to it. What about a refugee camp? Where do you get your police force? Where do you get your fire department? How do you set up your emergency services? Is that internal to the town, or does it have to be provided externally for the refugees? And what happens if they don't have it? Now that we know that there are a lot of people living in refugee camps, the question becomes, how do we get people out of these camps and out of the refugee status? And there are really only three ways, none of which really work. You have voluntary return, and that's, only going to work if the situation that caused the refugees to flee has been ameliorated, the country is stable, and they have something to go back to. If their farm is being occupied by their neighbor and they're going to have to go into a protracted fight because occupation is possession, they're going to be reluctant to go back to. If their city's been leveled, what are they returning to? Integration and naturalization is a good concept, but the problem is it's only going to work well if there's a small population of refugees integrating into a much larger overall host country population, and both groups wish for that to happen. Then you have resettlement in third countries, which again is basically forcibly moving refugees from one place to another, because while a refugee camp may not be the best place, it's fairly safe and fairly stable compared to what they fled, and definitely a more known entity than being picked up and drug across a country to go somewhere else. So resettlement might help out the host nation by moving the refugees to somewhere else, but it's not going to help the refugees, and the refugees are still going to be refugees. They're just going to be refugees in a different place. Internally displaced personnel. Those are people that have not left their border but are now essentially homeless. Now, per the International Displacement Monitoring Center, there are about 40 million internally displaced personnel in 57 countries and one territory. There's not a lot of information on these because they're not as regulated. It's not as much of a camp as it is a squat. All right, so you have squatters, and people in a similar status are those living in a slum. The largest slums in the world, over 2 million people. That's a lot of people crammed into an area that's not very nice, breeds a lot of resentment. So what makes it a slum? Well, Habitat for Humanity actually has a pretty good definition. You don't have secure land tenure. The person living there doesn't own the land nor necessarily pay rent to the actual land owner, because anywhere that you've got a bunch of people gathered together in a semi-legal status, you're going to have criminal organizations coming in trying to muscle their way to power. Slums are usually unsafe, or the homes are unhealthy. They're overcrowded. There's limited or no access to basic services, basic water, toilet, electricity, transportation. Unstable. All right, these are just thrown together. Weak structures blown away or destroyed during storms and earthquakes. So slums, camps, some parts of cities, they all have one thing in common. There's a lack of governance. And into this vacuum come the criminals, the insurgents, nefarious types, looking for the angry, the bitter, the dispossessed, those who are desperate. What do I mean by a lack of governance? All right, so within the UN, which does a good job of organizing camps, blocks may elect a leader. However, there's no connection between the block leader and the host nation or to the NGO running the camp. There may be, but there's no guarantee. It's not like they elected a mayor who then reports to the governor of the province. Slums have little or no representation. Both places, there's a lack of jobs, uncertain future, resentment, idleness. And into this vacuum come the gangs, the shadow governments, the insurgents, all looking for customers and recruits. Bring it all together. So we've talked about Carlos Magrela and his vision of the urban guerrilla and how he tries to justify the death, destruction, and mayhem guerrillas bring about based on the perception that the state has failed in its governance and has become corrupt. We've talked about the difference between a rural and an urban area and how the fact that urban areas are getting larger and there are more of them We now have more people living in an urban area than rural area for the first time in history. And we've talked about 3 places that are less well governed, and that would be a refugee camp, an IDP camp, and a slum. And how each of those places can become breeding grounds for instability. And the reason we need to understand this is because if we are tasked to help out the local government with stability and stability operations, we need to understand the unique situation that we find ourselves in and that we find the people that we're trying to help in. So with an understanding of that, it should make the jobs a little bit easier. I hope everyone found that informative. As usual, I'm going to offer up a book recommendation. The Mini Manual of the Urban Guerilla by Carlos Magrella. It's a very small book, about 80 pages, but it was the go-to manual for a very long time and is still probably in use today with various factions. If you understand it, you'll understand the forces that we're up against and the thinking behind how and why they do what they do. If you understand that, they become predictable. If they become predictable, you know how to stop them. Good luck.